Now let's discuss how we can compare two different objects. For the case of primitive types, you already know how we can compare them because there's already an intrinsic natural ordering defined for those items. For example, if you have two numbers, it's obvious how you can understand which one is larger or smaller. Similar is true also for other types like double, long, whatever. In the case of strings, that's also obvious, although string is not a primitive type. For the string, it's also obvious because you just look at the lexicographical or alphabetical order of the characters that form up the string, so you can understand which word comes before or after the other, just similar to what happens in a dictionary. However, when we start discussing the ordering between other objects, typically the objects you create, Java cannot know what you mean by a larger or smaller object. Here, it really depends on how you define those objects. For example, assume that you define a type named point, a new class. Now, if you have two different points, say P1 and P2, how can Java decide whether P1 comes before or after P2? Is it based on the X value or the Y value or any combination of these? Does it depend on the distance from the origin or on something else? You may directly say, for example, the distance from the origin could be the important thing, but it really depends. For example, in some cases, you might be looking at their projections onto the x-axis. So in other words, y would not be important for you. So Java cannot know which one is important or how you want to define the order. Similar true for example, array lists. What makes a full array list less or more than another one? Is it just the number of items or the values in those elements? So briefly, Java cannot know how you define your ordering between the elements. Therefore, it leaves it up to the programmer to decide and define how the ordering is done through a method which enables comparing two values. For example, if you have an array list of orderable values, you would like to use the sort method on that. But in order to be able to do sorting, then there should be an ordering defined. As we discussed in the previous slide, if we're talking about an array list of strings, now that's easy because we already know the natural ordering of the strings. We said it's the alphabetical order. So if, for example, we define an array list of strings, let's call it words, and we put in values like 4, score, and 7, years and ago. If you print the value of this array list, you will get what's given here. It's just these values entered in the order here using the add method, because remember, if you don't give this second parameter to add, it will be appending it to the end. So these are stored in the array list in the given order. However, when you call the sort method on words, remember the sort method is a static method of the collections class. So we don't say, in other words, we don't say words.sort, but we say collections.sort because it's a static method. And then as a parameter, give our object name, which is words as we have defined here. Now, when we call this sort method on words, it will take this array list and sort it. Well, how is it going to sort it? Since this is an array list of strings, it will be using the alphabetical order, so they will be stored in the alphabetical order. However, if we are talking about a class which is not defined in Java, but you define it, then as we said, Java does not know how to sort it. So the way to do it is you write a method named compare to. Actually, you're overriding the existing method. So you implement the compare to method, which returns actually an integer value. What the return value is, we're going to discuss. And if you're implementing the compare to method, in the definition of your class, you should say your class implements the comparable interface. So it's defined as an interface. So you say my class implements this interface, and there you define a type. You're comparing objects of your class with other objects typically of the same class type. So whatever your class name is, it will be the same name, as we'll see soon. So what's the return value? Let's first talk about the return value. You write the compare to method in a way that if your current object, which is x, is being compared against an object y, so you need to call the compare to method of x. So x is going to compare itself against its parameter, which is y. If x is less than y, you should be returning a value that's smaller than 0. Any negative value, it could be -1, -2, -2000, doesn't matter. As long as it's a negative value, it means the current object comes before the parameter object here, which is y in our case. If there if x comes either before or they are equivalent, then it would be returning either a negative value or 0. If they're the same, you should be returning 0 to mark equivalence. If x is different than 0, it should be something non-zero. But anyways, we said if it's equal, you're returning 0. And if it's not equal, then you would be either returning a negative value or a positive value. So that would be true. As I said, if it's something greater, if x is greater, or if x comes after y, then it should be returning a positive value. And for greater than or equal, it's returning a value that's either 0 or larger. Note the equivalence here. When you're using a primitive value like integer, double, float, whatever, you would be using the regular less than, or equal, whatever operator with the variable names, here, like x is less than y. But when we're talking about objects, you cannot say x is less than y. You have to call the compare to method, unfortunately. I know it's a little bit longer way, but you have to do it that way. You have to call the compare to method of one of the objects and give the other one as the parameter to that method. And the one that you're calling will be the first one, and the one you're giving as a parameter will be the second one. So the equivalent of this for the primitives, for the case of objects, it will be like this. So how are we going to implement it? As I said earlier, in your class, you're claiming that you're implementing the comparable method. For example, here we are looking at the definition of class point. So you say public class point, and then say implements comparable. Well, if you're implementing comparable, you have to implement the compare to method. And whatever the type of that type of the parameter of that method will be, you have to declare it also here. Typically, you will be comparing an object with another object of the same type. So if it's a point class definition, typically you will have point here. It could be different. Java allows this, but in general, it will be you will be using the same type. Then, when you're defining the overriding method compare to, you also define your parameter to be of the same type. So typically your class name, what you specify in comparable here, and what you specify as the parameter type in compare to method will be the same. So here is one example. We're defining a class named calendar date, and you would like to be able to compare the dates against each other. So you say it implements the comparable interface for calendar date type again. As a fields, we have two integer values, month and day. This is the constructor. And the important thing for us at the moment is this one. Here we define our compare to method. So we say public int compare to. Pay attention to that we're returning always an integer value. Remember, we're supposed to return either 0 for equivalence, a negative value if the current object comes before, or a positive value if the current object comes after. So it should not be Boolean, it should be integer. And as a parameter for the compare to method, we give an object of the same type. That parameter we are going to call other, and its type is the same as the type we have here, which is the name of the class also. So we get a parameter named other. The month and day fields of the current object, which were defined here, are compared against the month field of other and day field of other. Okay, here in this you could make the comparison in any ways, but here what we are doing is we are first checking if the month and the date, the month of the current object and the month of the parameter are the same or not. Now, if they're the same, let's first look at that because that's a simpler case. If they're the same, we will be jumping to the else part. So in the else part, we say you return. Now, since the months are the same, the two dates are in the same month, we're just comparing the days in that case. Note that here we're taking it simple. We're assuming that both dates are from the same year. So we're not looking at the year. So if they're in the same month, subtract the day field of the parameter from the current day. If it's larger, then it means the parameter comes after the current object. In other words, the current object comes before the parameter. And anyways, this expression will give a negative value, which is what we wanted. Or if the months are different, then we don't care about the days. Just look at the months. If the parameter comes after, again, this will be negative. If the current month comes later, then this will be a positive value, just as we wanted. So here's an example you can download. Note that I have just added this example, so if you have not already done so, just log out from Teaching.Codes and log in again, so it will bring the example in your Eclipse. So consider an example where we want to define a class we're going to name as student, which will implement the comparable interface. And for the comparison, actually in the class, we have two fields, the name of the student and the ID of the student. But for order for the comparison, we first look at the names. If the name of one student comes, say, before the other one, I don't care about their IDs. I'm just sorting them according to the names. But when the names are equal, then the tiebreaker will be the ID. We'll be sorting in that case for the ID. Typically in database systems, we call these the first and the second keys of comparison. So we're going to implement it this way. We have the student.java file, of course, and we also have in the project an available main.java, which makes use of student class and also provides some tests. So click on this button and Eclipse will bring it to your computer. Let me just open it this way. Okay. So if here I open the project and look into the source folder in the default package, I see two files, main Java and student Java. Let's first look at student Java. we have the name and ID fields defined as private. We have our constructor. This is the important part. This is where we have our compare to method implemented. So we're just doing what's explained here. The primary thing we're looking at for comparison is, first we look at the names. If the name of the, if the current object's name field is equal to the name of the other one, remember you can compare strings using the equals method. With the equals method, I'm comparing the current name, the current object's name, the current student's name against the name of the other student. If the name is the same and ID is the same, I'm going to return 0 because these are students with the same name and ID, so it's the same student, in other words. Because in my list, I'm going to allow duplicates. If I compare the names, and to do that, I will be using the compare to method of string. Remember, name is of type string. Actually, in the compare to method implementation, I'm using the compare to method of the field, which is also an object. So compare their names. I know how compare to should work. If the current name, the current object's name is before the parameter's name, then it should be returning a negative value. So for that, I'm going to return -1. If the names are equal, but the IDs of the current student is smaller than the ID of the parameter, again, this student comes before. So again, I have to return a negative value. Pay attention to that. I could have returned here, again, -1. No problem. It's fine. But it's my preference. I prefer to return a different value because this shows another case. Still, it comes before, but in the previous case, the current object was coming before because of the name. Now there's a name equivalence, but the IDs are different. So I just wanted to mark that. In the other side, if you just compare it against 0, they will both be less than 0, so they will both be treated as comes before. But this is some additional information I'm providing, although it was not asked in the question. And if they're not the same, if the current object does not come before, then guess what? It comes after. Therefore, for the other case, I'm just going to say return 1. Okay. Well, again, you could have made another check if you want to return 2, whatever, but I didn't do that. And here I've also implemented the toString method, which we're going to discuss later. So, which we already discussed, sorry. Let's also look at the main Java, how it works. Okay, here we create an array list of student, which was defined here, remember. An array list of student. I'm going to name that variable as student list. And here I construct my array list as empty. And I start pushing in values, as in here, using add. I have a student with the name Mehmet, and student ID is 5 simply. Ayşe has 8. Another student with the same name but different ID this time, the ID is 9. Another Mehmet in the same class, it's very common, with the ID of 1. Ayşe is also a common name, again the ID is different, 2. Orhan is another student. And note that here I have Mehmet, I don't know why, but the user has decided, for example, to add Mehmet for the second time into the list. So note that this is a duplicate entry, which means it's actually the same student because even the ID is the same. In the previous ones, the IDs were different, so I knew that they were different students with the same name. This time, it's the same student. You may, of course, not want to do it. In this example, we already have that. And below, with each separate if statement, you have different cases. I should have compared against 0 actually, but I just wanted to check if everything is working fine. Remember, I had different cases here. I'm just trying to check if I can handle each case properly. So I know that the answer here should have been -2, so I'm checking against -2. If so, I'm returning true. It means my implementation was correct. If not, it would display on the screen false, so I would detect my coding error and go and fix it. Okay, so if I'm comparing student 0, which happens to be Mehmet with ID 5, against 2, which is Mehmet with ID 9, this is the case where two students have the same name, but their IDs are different. So same name, the names are equal, but the IDs are different. In that case, I should be returning -2, and that's what I'm checking against. I'm checking against -2 to see if I'm really returning -2. If I compare Mehmet against Ayşe, Ayşe alphabetically comes before Mehmet. So since I'm calling the compare to method of Mehmet, it should be returning a positive value, in this case 1. When you compare again Mehmet 5 against number 3, which is this one, Selim, Mehmet comes before, so and the names are different, so it should be returning -1. If I compare again Mehmet 5 against 6, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so it's Orhan 12. Again, the names are different. Again, it should be returning -1. And finally, if I compare Mehmet 5 against Mehmet 5, which is the duplicate, remember, it should be returning 0 in that case, because if both the name and the IDs were equal, I was returning 0. So this is what I'm going to test. So also note that down here, I first display the student list, the current in the order that was entered, then call the sort method from the collections class. Remember, we discussed this. Again, sort was also a static implementation, a static method, and then display the sorted list. Let's see what the output will be. So I run this program. Let me just increase the console size. So for all of these cases, it returned true, so my implementation was correct. I saw that. This is a list before sorting. This is in the order they were entered. And this is what I see after sorting. See, it is Ayşe, then Mehmet, then Orhan, then Selim. So alphabetically, they're correct. And among the names, among the students with the same name, it's sorted according to their IDs, like Ayşe 2, Ayşe 2, Ayşe 8, Mehmet 1, 5, 5, because it's a duplicate, and then 9, Orhan and Selim. So everything is fine here. Okay, so we're done with that example. Let's look at another one. Here we have another example. The example is about reading a file this time, and reading the lines of the file and printing the lines in the reverse order, which means the bottom line should be at the top and the top line should be at the bottom. And also within each line, the words should be in the reverse order. Okay, but note that I'm saying the words should be in the reverse order. I'm not saying the letters in the words should be in reverse order. In other words, for example, if this highlighted text was the parameter, was the file that I was trying to reverse, the last line would be at the top. So it would start with this top line, and the former top line now will become the bottom, and this will again be in the middle. And also, for this line that comes to the top, it would read as you help to array list use, but not as UOYPLEH. So help is still help, you is still you, but their order would be changed. So how are we going to do that? For that, click on this and it will download. For my case, it's already here, so it opened very fast. For your case, you'll have to wait a little bit. So we're talking about the reverse file, but note that my comparison test is also open because that's the project I was working with earlier. So click on your current project and select close unrelated projects, and it will close all the projects that were already open. This will help us to manage our system easier, because sometimes it will run the other project and you will not be aware of that, so it will avoid that. Let's first discuss what this does. Let me just maximize this. So my class name is reverse file. It has two methods, the main method and the print reverse method. Let's start with the main method. In the main method, first I define a scanner for system in for the standard input. So I will be naming it as console because we say we read from the console. The console typically means the monitor and keyboard you're using. So I'm reading from the console. That's my input. And first, I write on the screen, ask the user, I'm prompting the user to enter the name of the file to be reversed. And the user enters just the file name. I'm adding the prefix resources. This is the directory name. And then whatever I need read from the input. So actually what we're doing is the file I'm going to read is actually stored here in a directory named resources. So the user is just supposed to enter this file name. I will be putting the prefix of the directory name slash then the file name. For example, here our file name is şakacışehir.txt. So it will read that. So it will be resources slash şakacışehir.txt. Anyways, and I define a new scanner. This time not for system in. That's what we did earlier. But this time we're going to read from a file. So I'm creating a file object, and as the parameter to the constructor of the file object, I'm giving the name I created here. So I will be giving as the parameter, in other words, the string resources slash şakacışehir.txt, the name of the file to be opened. So this file object will be created for this file, and I will be reading through this file from now on through the variable input. So in other words, you're reading from your console, the file name and the content of the file always through this input variable, which is also a type of scanner. Anyways, this is just about how you read from files if you already don't know how to do it from CMPE160. So we can now read from the file, and now remember the question said I should be reading I should be displaying the lines of the file in the reverse order. Okay, so I will need to read from the file line by line, but when I need to display it, I have to display it in the reverse order. Therefore, I have to store them in an array list, where each item of the array list will be a single line. Okay, so using the hasNextLine method, I can read from the file line by line. From where am I reading from? From the input, which was, remember, defined as a scanner here. So from my input file, I'm reading line by line as long as there is a line. So next line reads me the value, but I need to make sure that there's really something to read in the file. So if it has next line, I'm first making sure if there's something to read in the file or not, so that I don't get an error. As long as the file has something more to read, I read using input.nextLine a full line till the end of line character. read it into a string which is added into the lines array list of string here, which was defined here. So once again, input next line, or let me start from here. Input has next line tells me whether there's something more to read in the file or not, because I might have reached the end of the file. As long as there's something to read one full line, and whatever that full line is, that will be returned as a string by next line. That full line will be added to the lines array list, which I already defined here in line 14. And do this in a while loop. So in every iteration, read one line, put it into the array list. Note that I didn't do any processing yet. I'm just reading from the file line by line and putting it into an array list. And then once I've done that, when I come to the beginning of this for loop in line 18, I already have everything, all the content in my array list line by line. Okay, but note that the lines have not been reversed yet. I can print them in the reverse order, and that's what the for loop here does. So this starts from lines.size, which is the number of elements in this array list, -1, because remember the last index is 1 less than the size because we start enumeration from 0. So starting I from there and decrementing I by 1 in every iteration until I becomes negative. So I read the lines in the reverse order, but remember I also need to flip the string inside the line, and that will be done by the print reverse method I've implemented here. So as the parameter to print reverse, what I'm passing is the ith line, and remember I starts from the last one. So in a reverse, print in reverse order the last line, then print in reverse order the line before, then the line before, then the line before, until the first line, which is line number 0. So let's see, and when we're done with this, for loop, what we do is we close our scanner for the console, and we also close our file, and that's it. Anyways, now let's look at print reverse. Remember, print reverse takes one parameter, which is a string. This string comes from lines, which is an array list of string. So for the first time it's called, for example, what S contains will be the full line for the last line of the file. So take S, okay? I need to separate the words in this full line, okay? So I need to store the words in this line word by word in an array list of string, but words. Remember, when you look at lines, each element of lines is one full line. In the case of words, each element will not be a full line, but it will be one word in the line, in the specific line, okay? So I'm just trying to separate the words in the line. So this time, again, I'm defining a scanner. Again, I named it input. I could have used another name, doesn't matter. But pay attention. Earlier, I had said the input is based on a file here. I created a file object and gave the name of the file there. So I was reading from a file. So I was, in other words, attaching the scanner to a file. I either attach the scanner to the system input, which is your keyboard, or to a file here. And this time, I'm attaching the scanner to S, which is my parameter. Now, this is interesting. We're attaching a scanner to a string. Anyways, a file or the keyboard, all these are treated as sources of characters one after another, just like a string. So I can also attach my scanner to a string, and that's what we do here. So now from S, what we're doing is we're looking at if input has next, which means does it have a other word. Does it have the next word? This time, the next method we use here reads word by word, not character by character, pay attention. It reads word by word, separated with white space, which means blank, tab character, or the new line character. So you read word by word from input, which is attached to the string, which comes as the parameter to us. And I need to make sure that there's still a word to read. My input or my string has not ended yet. Okay, as long as there's something to read and put it to the words array list, just as we did in here. It's very similar to what we did here. Okay, here we read the file line by line. Now from each line we're reading word by word. Now at the end of this while loop, all words in that specific line will be stored in our array list with the name words. So as long as it's not 0, the element, the number of words in that line is not 0, you just put those on the screen one by one. Well, since these are separate words, I should also put a blank in between. Okay, so what I'm doing is I put a blank, then the next word, blank word, blank word. It works this way. Okay, so if I started from words size -1 rather than -2, I would have a space, an empty space, even before the first word. You could just say, so what's the big deal? Fine, you could work that way. Well, I'm a picky person, so I didn't want that. So what I'm doing is, for the first word, I'm just directly writing it without looking at, without putting a space in front. For the others, the rest comes with a prefix of a single blank. Okay. When I'm done with all these in this for loop, I write all of them. When I'm done, I just make a new line and also close my string. So it will close my scanner here. It will loop back and repeat the same thing for the next line, and it will work this way. So I hope you also understand this.